Welcome everyone. Welcome to the Celebrate Black History and Culture from a Science and Engineering Perspective. We're really excited to have this webinar. So my name is Lynn Mayo. I'm CEO of RePicture. And if you don't know RePicture, I encourage you to go to our website, repicture.com. RePicture is telling the stories of engineers, scientists, and their projects. And our mission is to increase interest and diversity in engineering and science. This is part of our RePicture STEM Summer Resume Builder program, and that is a program for college and high school students whose summers were impacted by COVID-19. And they want to basically have something meaningful this summer. And so our program is actually done in 1 week sprints. So we still have 2.5 weeks left. It goes through August 9th. So if you know a student who would like to apply to our program, please encourage them to apply. There's no cost. It's really just our goal is to help students have a meaningful summer. And so to apply, you can go to repicture.com students and they can apply there. And so with that, I'd like to introduce our host for our webinar, and that's Dr. Mosey London. Dr. London has his BS in civil engineering and environmental engineering from Lafayette College. He also has a PhD in civil engineering concentrated in transportation engineering from the University of Delaware. And if you want to learn more about Dr. London and his STEM story, you can go to repicture.com/people, and you'll see he is one of the people we feature on our website. But one of the interesting stories that he shares on his site is why he chose to be an engineer. And why he chose to be an engineer, how he became interested in engineering, was actually as a child playing a video game, and specifically the video games, The Sims, where you're creating cities. So that's actually an example. I know as parents don't like to have our kids in video games, but at least we have one example of a youngster that basically did a video game and became an engineer because of it. So Dr. London is a transportation planning program manager at AECOM. Dr. London serves on the executive board for the William Anderson Fund Alumni Network. And their mission is to expand the number of historically underrepresented professionals in the field of disaster and hazard practice. So it's a really important area, and we appreciate his work in that as well as the other areas. So again, we're excited to have Dr. London, and we're excited to hear this important presentation.
Great. Well, thank you, Lynn, for that very detailed introduction. It's much appreciated. And welcome all to today's webinar. Today, I'm joined by my fellow colleagues at AECOM who will be speaking about their experiences. But first, I'd like to introduce Sean Russo. Sean is Operations Leadership Associate Vice President with over 25 years of experience at AECOM. Sean is responsible for project management, civil and pedestrian trail design, and planning of multidisciplinary transportation projects from conceptual development to final design. He provides day-to-day contact as project management for multiple projects and clients, as well as business development. Sean has a strong focus on the pedestrian realm related projects, tasks aimed to enhance the communities through integration of complete streets concepts, traffic calming, LID, multimodal transportation, and introduction of sustainable design practices. Sean is attuned to the community and the client concerns to improve the urban fabric of neighborhoods and communities of all sizes with successful project execution. With that, Sean, take it away.
Thanks, Mosey. Thank you, Dr. Mayo, for inviting and allowing AECOM to participate in this RePicture event. Had a chuckle to myself a little bit hearing about Mosey's rise to engineering, a few years older. So I started in engineering by playing with Legos and Matchbox cars in the backyard, making bridges and tunnels and buildings and castles. It wasn't electronic, it was analog. So again, thank you for inviting us to be here. To many from RePicture, you may not know who AECOM is. So we want to take this opportunity to give a quick overview of what we do and how that plugs into STEM. Next slide. So who we are. So at AECOM, we specialize in infrastructure, and that covers everything from how water gets to your house to how you get to school and work, and everything in between. Next slide. So fortunately, we're a very large company. With that size comes a lot of benefits and diversity. Diversity in the staff we have and the type of work that we can do for our communities, for the planet, etc. So globally, pretty much on every continent, we've got about 87,000 people, over $20 billion in revenue, so extremely large. But the true core of what we do lies in our people, and you're going to see that through the speakers today. Next slide. I think this quote here really sums it up, and it's about creating opportunity for everyone. I know when you get through this presentation, you hear, say, Alan Harwood talk about the one project we're doing in DC. Truly, that's what's at the heart of it, creating opportunity, connecting the past to the future. And that's what's really exciting about the type of work that science, engineering, planning could bring to our communities. So no matter where you're at in that spectrum of learning and that career path, this is a career that is for everyone and that benefits all communities. Next slide. So again, just an overview of what AECOM does and what does infrastructure mean. So you can see in this diagram that whether it's energy, how electricity is most efficiently delivered to your home or business, to the water and sewer, or transportation. Most of us on the call here, we focus on transportation. But I think this diagram also does the whole science and engineering industry service because it is a holistic model. And that's how we work, and that's how this presentation on Black History Month really developed. Because we work closely together and with one another, we understand the importance of sharing, to knowing where we came from and where we're going. And we bring that to our science practice. You know, how can we integrate buildings with transportation? How can we do it smarter? How can we look at the sustainability and the environmental aspects and bring that all together? So I do challenge you as you continue your studies to keep that in mind. Really focus on the holistic and the bringing. We don't work in silos. Next slide, Mosi. And again, underpinning what we do and what you do, it's our people. We couldn't be as successful as we are if we didn't have a workforce that was diverse, that has the opportunity to be included in a wide variety of projects and to hear their voice and be part of the conversation going forward. Because we live in the community, we work in the community. So it's, again, important that that all comes together. So we're excited to have you listen and participate in what we're going to tell you about Black History Month and how it's impacted our speakers over their careers, and some really, really interesting history to keep in mind going forward. So thank you.
Thank you, Sean. So yes, with that introduction, we'll dive right into the presentation, celebrating Black history and culture from a science and engineering perspective. As all meetings start with AECOM, we always start with a safety moment, and safety is always a critical piece of what we do. For today, the safety moment is road safety. As you are all going out on your day-to-day businesses and activities, even though you're quarantined, it's important to just keep in mind road safety, whether you're in a vehicle, a pedestrian, or on a bicycle, or a shared mobility service such as a scooter or a moped. Especially right now, a lot of people are getting stir crazy, so it's important that when you're traveling from your different destinations to ensure that you're following the rules and regulations of the road. So we'll start off with this quote: "Black history isn't a separate history. This is all of our history. This is American history. We need to understand that." Karyn Parsons. And I think this quote is pretty similar to what we're talking about today, is that the work that we do currently is built upon the work that has been done over the years by our fellow Americans in terms of infrastructure, design, science, STEM fields, in terms of what we see today in the built environment. So we had the overview of AECOM by Sean. In terms of the current professionals that will be sharing their perspectives, includes myself, Mosi London, Surfa Asakanake, Alan Harwood, Thomas Trapnell, and Derek Krieger. And I'll provide detailed introductions for each of them once their section comes up. To begin, my section is just focusing on a person that's dear to my heart, Dr. Eugene M. DeLoatch. Dr. Eugene, he's currently a full professor and dean emeritus at the School of Engineering from Morgan State University. Barack Obama sent a letter to him to celebrate his work of 50 years in U.S. education, identifying him as the best of the best in the field of engineering. For me, why he's close and dear to my heart is that he's one of the first African-American graduates from Lafayette College, my undergraduate institution in engineering, as a part of the class of 1959. So his work and paving the way of being one of the first African-American graduates of that institution allowed me to attend there. And while I was a senior upon graduation, I was actually awarded recognition award that was in his name and the work that he continues to do. So for me, I always look back at that award and my time at Lafayette College as instrumental in terms of what I do today and the contributions that I do to my community. Currently, Dr. Lynch, he serves as the president of the American Society of Engineering Education and is a life member and fellow of the society, which was founded in 1893. So I think for us as professionals, it's also important to bridge the gap between academia. All of us were once students and we're always continuing learning. So it's important for us to stay connected with the academic community and acknowledge the work that has been done in that regard. With that, I'll transition into Surfel. Surfel is a civil engineer with experience in traffic signal design for new intersections and traffic control plans development for maintenance of traffic during construction. His traffic engineering experience includes performance of traffic studies, design of traffic signals, ITS communications, and signaling and pavement marking concepts, development of traffic control plans, and design and implementation of complete street concepts. Surfel experienced in the use of civil design, traffic analysis, and traffic modeling software packages, including MicroSim, AutoCAD, HES, Synchro, SimTraffic, and Visit. With that being said, I turn it over to Surfel.
Today, I'm here to talk about Garrett Morgan. He was an entrepreneur and an inventor who came up with a lot of ideas that had huge impacts in many lives. He made improvements to the sewing machine, and he also made an invention into the first human hair straightener. So who is Garrett Morgan? So Garrett Morgan was born in Paris, Kentucky on March 4th, 1877, and was the 7th of 11 children born to a free slave father. In his mid-teens, Morgan moved to Cincinnati, Ohio to look for work and was a handyman to a wealthy landowner. And although he only completed an elementary school education, he was able to pay for more lessons from a private tutor to expand his education. After working at several sewing machine factories, he obtained a patent for improved sewing machine and eventually opened his own repair business. He later moved to Cleveland, Ohio, and established himself as a successful businessman where he experimented and invented the first hair straightener. With the success of this product, he was able to have enough financial security to pursue other interests. In 1914, Morgan patented a breathing device or a safety hood, providing a person wearing it with a safe breathing experience in the presence of smoke or gases or other pollutants. He worked hard to market the device, especially to fire departments by demonstrating the reliability in fires. This device later became a prototype and a precursor to the gas mask used in World War I. And it protected a lot of soldiers from toxic gas used in warfare. This invention earned him the first prize at the Second International Expo of Safety and Sanitation in New York City. But this success didn't come without resistance among buyers because of his race, particularly in the South. And to counter this, he often hired a white actor to pose as the inventor, and he would pose as the the inventor's sidekick. In 1916, there was a tunnel explosion by Lake Erie and trapped workers underground amidst suffocating noxious fumes and dust. And upon hearing this explosion, Morgan and his brother put on the breathing devices, made their way to the tunnel, and were able to save lives of the workers trapped in the tunnel. So eventually, New York adopted the breathing device, followed by 500 cities to protect firefighters from smokes and fumes. And Morgan was the first Black person in Cleveland to own a car. And at that time, the streets were far from safe. The streets were getting very busy with cars, carriages, bikes, and pedestrians all sharing the streets. And with the intersections becoming more dangerous, as we transition from free intersections to two-stage traffic signals, where there were indicators for traffic to either stop or go. And in this case, traffic from the opposing side will start moving before the traffic that had the green light can clear the intersection. So after witnessing a carriage accident at a particularly problematic intersection in the city, Morgan decided to do something about it and eventually came up with a three-position traffic signal. And this was the rudimentary version of the modern three-way traffic signal, where he introduced the always stop. And as you can see from the diagram, it was effective and made intersections much safer by introducing the clearance phase, which is this box number 2, where it gave time for vehicles to actually cross the intersection before the opposing traffic starts moving. So even though, for me, even though he was not an engineer, he was able to solve problems by looking for solutions. And he shows us how to persevere no matter what the pushback is from the other side. And personally, as a traffic engineer, it kind of gives me an idea of where my field went through as like one of the stops in traffic engineering. So thank you.
Thank you, Sir Fel. So our next presenter is Alan Harwood. Alan is an urban planning vice president at AECOM. He has over 25 years of award-winning experience in community-based economic revitalization, urban planning, and environmental impact analysis. Alan has excellent instincts and strategic approach, strong leadership skills, and a personal commitment to each project that he's on. His project responsibilities include overall direction, client coordination, team leadership, product quality, and public presentations. Alan has successfully completed challenging projects for a variety of clients, including federal agencies, local governments, and community private sector interests. His work on commercial and mixed-use development, sports facilities and attractions, and open space and cultural resources has been recognized with more than 25 professional awards since 1990. Prior to AECOM, Alan worked for a public planning agency, an engineering firm, and a commercial builder. With that, I hand it off to Alan.
Thank you, Mosey. Hi, my name is Alan Harwood, and I'm pleased and honored to be part of this session. And as a planner, you're probably wondering what I'm doing as part of an engineering program, but I think we're close cousins. Planners are kind of a cross between an architect and an engineer. And I'm going to talk about Frederick Douglass, the famed statesman, because we are working on the Frederick Douglass Memorial Bridge. The Frederick Douglass Memorial Bridge is a replacement to the current dilapidated bridge, and it's soaring over the Anacostia River. It's going to bring a new iconic, bold design to the forgotten river. And it's really, I think it's interesting that we're going to bring a cultural connection to engineering and to infrastructure. AECOM is the engineer of record on this bridge, and also I'm the visual quality manager to make sure that we're building what we said we're going to build. And if you're going to commemorate someone, you kind of have to learn a little bit about them. So we did a fair amount of research about Frederick Douglass. Next slide, please. And I think most folks have probably seen this image. It's an iconic image of the dramatic, the sage of Anacostia, as he's known. He's an orator, a statesman, an ambassador. And that means he was really well known for several things. He was the original civil rights leader. He was eloquent and persuasive speaker, a great intellectual leader of the time. He was the prominent voice of the 1800s. And if you think about it, it really was emancipation was the big issue of the 1800s. He gave multiple speeches. He wrote 3 autobiographies. He founded a newspaper and even received vote for president in 1888. And he is, I think there's a little bit more to him than that. I think most people don't know about his younger years. So, Frederick Douglass was born on the Eastern Shore. He was born into slavery. He was moved to Baltimore, where he learned the alphabet, and then he taught himself to read. He was punished for learning how to read and sent back to the Eastern Shore and really kind of punished in a physical way. He escaped to Boston and became the conscience of the nation. He was an abolitionist and went from slave to self-made man and self-educated man to a real intellect of the time. He encouraged the Emancipation Proclamation. He helped recruit Black soldiers for the Union side of the war, and he fought for equal pay for those soldiers. He was also a big proponent of women's voting rights before that was common. So it's just an amazing kind of story. And he became a friend of President Lincoln and was in the White House several times. So to really kind of recognize and commemorate his life and really kind of the cultural relationship of the engineering to Frederick Douglass, there's 4 belvederes, if you can see on the screen, those bump outs along the bridge. Those are overlooks that are kind of for pedestrians to stop and take in the river, take in the views. And at each one of those is going to be a plaque, a large 15-foot long plaque that's going to have an image of Frederick Douglass and a quote or a saying of his, and then some background imagery. And what we're going to try to really accomplish is commemorate the full life of the man. And so the younger versions face toward the federal city, toward the left there. Those 2 on the left are facing toward the federal city, and the 2 on the right are when he's a little bit older, and they're facing the Anacostia Highlands, where Cedar Hill, his final resting home, was. He lived the last 17 years there. So each one is going to be stainless steel, as I said, 15 feet, and we'll look closer at each one of those, but they're really going to try to tell the story for people that are moving through this space and really stopping to take in the views of the river. So the first one is probably his most famous saying, and it is easier to build strong children than repair broken men. This is an image of him in 1847. He was about 29 years old, and it's an appropriate quote. We try to pick timeless quotes, ones that were appropriate then, very relevant now, and will stay appropriate for many years. The background image is really the map of the river, what it was like back in the 1800s. So this one is really a quote about free speech. And in this image, it's 1860, about 1860. He's around 42 years old, and he's already starting to kind of really become known as an orator and an intellectual. And the quote is, "To suppress free speech is a double wrong. It violates the rights of the hearer as well as those of the speaker." And again, we have continuing throughout our history to wonder about people that speak out, and I think this is an eloquent way of saying that it really is important to be able to challenge folks. He in fact challenged President Lincoln at times. That's probably another story. So in this particular image, this is from 1879, and he's about 61 years old. And what's in the background is his own letters, and on the right-hand side there of the image. And then the quote from that in his own handwriting. He's actually got a font that's named after, it's a Frederick Douglass font that you can look up. And this is really about criticizing the country, and instead of kind of excusing it. And I think we thought this was also very appropriate. And I am one of those who think that the best friend of a nation is he who most faithfully rebukes her for her sins, and he her worst enemy who, under the specious and popular garb of patriotism, seeks to excuse, palliate, and defend them. And the final one is really also a kind of a universal, pretty well-known Spain. And this is with an image of him from 1887. He's about 69 years old, again, looking towards Cedar Hills. And that's a picture on the left there. That's his home overlooking Anacostia. It's a National Historic Site now. And it's people may not get all that they work for, but they certainly must work for all that they get. And it's a nice kind of closing argument for the way he lived his life. He earned and or took his own freedom, but learned and taught himself everything, and became quite the statesman and really the original, as I said, the original civil rights leader. And I think with that, we'll turn this back to Mosey.
All right, thank you, Alan. Next, we have Loss of History by Thomas Trapnell. Thomas is a structural engineer with over 5 years of experience at AECOM. He has supported an on-call station and bike ride planning efforts for WMATA, the local metro system here in the DMV area, transit asset management planning, and tunnel inspections for Virginia Department of Rail and Public Transport, concourse construction for Metropolitan Washington Airports Authority, general engineering services for CSX, the freight service in the region, as well as construction engineering services for the District Department of Transportation. With that being said, I turn it over to Tom.
Good afternoon, everyone. As Mosey said, my name is Thomas, and I'm going to be talking about the loss of history. I'm going to be looking at music and baseball. So the Negro Leagues. The Negro Leagues were a group of leagues that were developed in the 1800s that mostly comprised African-American baseball players, because African-Americans' memberships into the Major League Baseballs was rejected in 1867. So it was kind of a reaction to that. And there were several small leagues that started out, and they didn't really get anywhere, and they successfully went under. And it wasn't until around 1920 that the Negro National League was formed by Rube Foster, and he was able to take these smaller leagues and make it into actual something competitive against the MLB, and was able to actually have, black athletes play and get some recognition. But all good things, don't last forever. And in 1947, when Jackie Robinson joined the MLB, that really marked the end of the Negro National League. It was, Jackie Robinson entering the MLB wasn't automatic integration for the rest of the players, but it really started taking away from the Negro Leagues, some of the players trying to get into the MLB, and some of the spectators for the Negro National League, started paying attention to the more lucrative MLB. And so by 1958, the Negro Leagues were officially over. And why I thought this was really important was that not everybody knows about the Negro Leagues, and some of the black players that played weren't able to transition to the MLB like Jackie Robinson and others were. And so that their records, their history has kind of been lost. There's actually a Negro League museum that you can go to, but it doesn't have as much prominence, of course, as the MLB museum does. So I'm going to talk about music here. In Rolling Stone's 50th anniversary issue, they had an article talking about how Elvis Presley invented rock and roll. And it created some backlash, some considerable backlash, because rock and roll wasn't created by Elvis Presley. He never even said that. He would, of course, deny that. Rock and roll was invented by a group of people who included like Fats Domino, Little Richard, Jerry Lee Lewis, Chuck Berry, Elvis, Bo Diddley, Buddy Holly, among others. And rock and roll was, the phrase was actually coined by a disc jockey in 1954. By Rolling Stone, saying this stuff, it kind of takes away from all these people who were the true inventors, but also these early pioneers that never were able to get the recognition that their white peers got because of their skin color. They weren't marketed the same way. People such as Muddy Waters, Howlin' Wolf, who's pictured here, Robert Johnson, Sister Rosetta Tharpe, these people who impacted, influenced, some of the greatest rock and roll bands and artists of the time, such as, Led Zeppelin. And so this Marty McFly sings Johnny Be Good. That's just a fun little anecdote about Back to the Future, how even in pop culture, there's this idea of, mislabeling things and taking away things. Marty McFly plays Johnny Be Good, and Chuck Berry's cousin is overhearing it and gives it to Chuck Berry. But this quote by Nina Simone really stuck with me. It's a really powerful quote. Jazz is a white term to define black people. My music is black classical music. And whether or not, that first part is true, I thought it was great to see her fighting against people mislabeling her music and reducing her music to something that it wasn't. That her music was a lot more than just jazz. It encompassed a lot more. And that fight is still ongoing. Currently, the Grammys just announced that they are getting rid of the urban category. So as we've seen throughout this presentation, a lot of this stuff, especially with those quotes by Frederick Douglass, a lot of this stuff is still relevant today. And it's important that we always take note of our history. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Thomas. So I think that makes a great segue to our last presenter, but definitely not least, Derek Creeder. He has a wealth of experience both here in the United States as well as abroad. And I think he'll be able to link all the different cultural as well as infrastructure and STEM elements that we've discussed together. Derek is a business development associate vice president at AECOM with 10 years working with the company and almost 40 years of experience in the industry, including transit and transportation planning, design, and engineering. He has supported long-term projects and assignments as far west as Honolulu, Hawaii, as well as far east as Abu Dhabi, plus most of the transit-friendly areas of the mainland US. So with that being said, I transfer over to Derek.
Okay, thanks very much. 40 years and still standing. So I focus a bit more on 5 named people and 1 unknown person. So we'll start off with La Negresse. Some of these are personal relationships I've had with cities where I've lived. La Negresse is a section of Biarritz. And quite honestly, today, the name has become quite the controversy. It has really fired up social media, but the name is 200 years old. Next slide. And if you come out of the train station, which you see to the right, you'll see a traffic circle that's entitled La Negresse, and you might wonder what the history is behind it. This goes back to about 1813 when, during the combats of that period, soldiers came back, and that area of Biarritz was really the countryside. And there was an inn that was maintained by a black woman, and there were very few blacks in the area at the time. So it became a very popular place. It was very well maintained, and everyone started to call it La Negresse. So the name holds for today. And interestingly enough, if you take the TGV to Biarritz today, you get off at the train station, as the sign says. No one will say the train station or they go to Biarritz. Everyone will say that I'm getting off at La Negresse. So the person is unknown, but it's famous 200 years later. So let's move on to the next named person, Cap Wigington. Okay, we're starting 1883. So in the background, you see the magnificent Cathedral of St. Paul. This was once my home. And St. Paul gets a cathedral. Minneapolis only gets a basilica. So Cap Wigington was an architect born in Kansas. He moved to Omaha, and his next stop was St. Paul. And that he became the city architect is quite remarkable for a black person at the time. St. Paul had recently implemented a civil service system where people were required to take an exam, face unseen. He received the highest grade. So he became the lead draftsman. He was supposed to have initially become the architect, but they were quite surprised. He became the draftsman, but then again, he did become the architect eventually. He designed many buildings. 60 of his buildings are still standing in St. Paul. 4 are on the National Register. You see the Highland Park Water Tower now is still standing. It is not leaning, despite the way it looks in this photograph. He was also very active in community services. One was the Black militia in the Twin Cities. At that time, the Twin Cities was quite segregated, and surprisingly, St. Paul was the diverse city, and Minneapolis was not. Things have changed since that time. The Sterling Club, he was very active in that, and that was the club for bellboys, waiters, and drivers, which were the common occupations of many Black men in the city in that era, but also railroad porters. And as you see at the lower right, the Union Depot in St. Paul was a prime destination. It was a key transfer point. Many of these railroad workers had runs from Chicago to the Twin Cities, namely St. Paul. And that was the transfer point where the other workers would start at St. Paul, moving on to Seattle and to Portland, Oregon. Why is this important? It leads to labor, which is an important aspect of transportation. A. Philip Randolph was a labor unionist. And in the backdrop, you see here one of the magnificent train stations, the first union station in the United States. A. Philip Randolph was a union organizer. He was responsible for the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. The first attempts were not successful. The railroads basically hired scabs to come in, and they really ruined a lot of jobs. However, he was determined. By 1934, the Railway Labor Act was passed. Moving on from that, Pullman began to negotiate. By that time, the set of members in the unions had risen to 7,000, and they finally had gained a foothold and gotten to speak proactively with the railroads. What did that do? They were able to move from really miserable working conditions, 24-hour shifts, basically having no rights, to basically getting a contract with pay increases, with a shorter work week, and for overtime pay. And this is really important as it lives on through today, because our relevance is right to work in unions and how they played a very, very key part in assuring that many minorities that worked in transportation and other industries were able to achieve the same rights, rules, regulations, and benefits as whites at that time. It led to equal rights and the Equal Rights Amendment. And then if we look at today, we can still see this bearing through with our fair labor and wage laws, and as well as employee versus employer rights. And for the transit industry, we got into things such as directly operated versus contracted labor. Okay, I've talked a bit about transit and railroads, so now something completely different. So this is a focus on transportation. Bessie Coleman was an aviator, born in 1892 in Atlanta, Texas, and she moved to Chicago. For those of you that dare to drive to Chicago's O'Hare Airport rather than taking public transportation, you might see an exit there that said Bessie Coleman Drive. The first time I saw it many years ago, I had to look up and see, well, who was Bessie Coleman? After moving to Chicago, she worked as a beautician, and she was absolutely intrigued with the soldiers who had recently returned from Europe. They talked about the rights, opportunities, the things that they could do in Europe that they were not able to do in the United States. She always wanted to fly. It was an aspiration. So she saved money. She sought out schools in the US. At that time, no women and no Blacks were allowed. So a theme again, France. 1920, she moved to France. She did achieve an aviation license. She continued to fly. She took advanced flight courses. Ultimately, she returned to the United States in 1922. She could not get a job flying anyone, but she became an air show phenomenon. Her first air show debut, she did figure eights, she did stunts. She became more and more famous. She became known as Queen Bess. That came to an untimely end 4 years later on April the 30th when she fell from a dive of 2,000 feet. That was her last stunt. But she lives on in aviation history, one of the strongest and one of the best. So I've talked about France quite a bit. So a light rail has made a great comeback, as the slide showed. And I got to a station named Rosa Parks. I was really quite surprised. I think many people are familiar with Rosa Parks and what she did. Born in 1913 in Tuskegee, Alabama, she moved on to Montgomery. And then Montgomery in 1954 I could say she began what we can call the sit against discrimination, where she refused to cede her seat to a white patron. That was the beginning of a long boycott in Montgomery, where people just began to walk, and it really brought the transit system to an end. And ultimately, it led to the 14th Amendment. Segregation was abolished in public transportation, and the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause finally was enacted. So it's important today to really look at what that has led to. It's equal rights and equity and public accommodation, but it's also led to some other aspects about transportation and the provision with transit. Title VI, policy where we make sure that we provide transportation equally to all those who receive it. The Americans with Disability Act and environmental justice, making sure that any transportation element does not adversely impact a minority group. So if you find yourself in Paris, do take a ride on this LRT line. Not only will you see Rosa Parks as a key station, but you'll notice they're all women. About 2 stops down the line to the east is Ella Fitzgerald. So not only transportation. Gladys West, mathematician, born in 1930 in Sutherland, Virginia. Happy to say that she is still in Virginia in the DC metro area. She was a researcher, and her first work was an astronomical study that proved the regularity of Pluto's motion relative to Neptune. So I say it's quite a scholarly work. After that, she moved on to analysis of data from satellites to develop models of Earth's shape, which led to computer programming to learn our precision locations on Earth. And I think everyone can guess what the key outcome of that was, something that we all know very much today, and that's GPS. So we can thank Dr. Gladys West for that. And she was inducted into the Air Force and Missile Pioneers Hall of Fame in December of 2018. And with that, thank you. Just a brief set of tidbits about interesting transportation facts.
All right, thank you, Derek. So we definitely covered a lot, but we also want to leave you with some resources and action items. Based on the different presentations that we gave, there have been personal stories as well as physical manifestations and infrastructure that reflect Black history and the impact that it continues to have on the built environment. So as you continue to engage with the material, these are just some suggestions in terms of reading, watching, and listening. We formulated these 4 C's. It's important to stay curious, keep conversing, be uncomfortable, definitely with the conversations that we're having today within our families, our friends, as well as our work environments. It's important to acknowledge the impacts of individuals in the past, but also what can we do to prevent the disenfranchisement of minorities and vulnerable populations in the future. And then last but not least, connect with resources. So with that being said, we wanted to just open it up for Q&A, whether it's about the specific people or projects that we talked about here today, or just about our experiences working in the transportation sector. So thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Mosey. Great presentations. Actually, thank to each of you for those presentations. They're very informative. And I'm going to start with the question. We actually do have a number of student questions, but I just want to start with the question myself. And that is, and I think like you said at the beginning, it's so important for us to kind of understand our history in order to kind of go to the future and recognizing some of this isn't that old history. You know, some of it, you know, is relatively recent, and yet it's unknown. My question is for, you know, a number of these students, you know, do you have suggestions for them of how do we make sure that we don't lose the history that's going or more recent, so that 50 years from now they don't have to have a similar presentation about, you know, the kind of the lost history. So do you have any suggestions for these students as they start their career to make sure they really embrace all of the history?
I could take that first, and I suggest any of the other presenters to chime in. I think the biggest thing, going back to the first C's, is being curious. Not all the information that you would want to know about history. Even when we first did this presentation internally at AECOM, I learned a lot of things that I did not know before. But I think the most important thing is that even after you finish your academic career, so continue on after college or grad school, is to stay curious. It's a constant education and learning process. So every day, if there's something new that you can learn to put into your catalog, I think that's the most important thing. And don't be afraid to share that information with others. I think a fault that we assume or issue of being ignorant or not knowing something is that we tend to not just inquire about it. But I think that the most important thing is just to be open to the learning process. And there's information that you've just come across that's new to you that you've never seen. There's likely other people that have it as well. So it's all about sharing that information with others.
Okay, great. And again, if people have questions, they can put it in the chat or put in the private chat, or you can just chat that we can turn your mic on. But I'll go with a couple other questions I got through the private chat, and that was regarding the presentation about the Frederick Douglass Bridge. And one of the students wanted to know, like, who made the decision to incorporate the Frederick Douglass story into the bridge?
Well, I think it was really it's a replacement for the existing Frederick Douglass Memorial Bridge. And I think as we had to design a bridge and win a competition to have the right to build it. And I think we as a team decided that we thought it should reflect the man, the full measure of the man, as we said. It was very much a team effort. I led the urban design and landscape architecture team. Nanxing Tao, Broderick Spencer, Reed Fellenbaum, Ignacio Booster Onsa. There's so a very diverse and multi-talented and multidisciplinary team, and we all felt very strongly that it should do that. And we toyed around a couple of different things. We had a timeline at one time. We had as I mentioned, he had a very distinctive handwriting, so we were thinking of having his signature writ large, literally on the bridge. We tried a couple of different things, but we really settled on places where people were going to stop and gather and have a pause a moment to kind of really reflect as the best place to commemorate him. So very much a team effort, but hopefully we'll see the fruits of that labor shortly when it opens in another year.
Okay, great. And actually, Alan, while you're here, there's another question from a student, and that was, for the Frederick Douglass Bridge, how often do infrastructure projects connect culture? I assume they're asking how often do you have that opportunity to connect culture in the infrastructure project?
Well, I've been fortunate to work on the Martin Luther King Memorial and the National Museum of African American History and Culture, but those were cultural projects. And that's actually where my background as an urban planner is in placemaking and the mix of land use and culture and history. I'm probably not the right person to answer actually the transportation projects. I'm not a transportation planner. I'm an urban planner. But I think it's relatively rare, but I think it's becoming more and more common in my experience as infrastructure and big engineering projects become more complex. People are realizing they can do more than just connect people from point A to point B, or to provide a new service from one area that is underserved to another area, like in terms of utilities or water or electricity, but actually maybe do some other things along the way. And I think one of the ones that I was not involved in, but I know our transportation group was, the kind of configuration of Southern Avenue in Washington, D.C. And while rebuilding the road, creating a linear park along it. And for a fraction, an infinitesimal amount of extra dollars, it really made a great impact to the neighborhood. So, but I'd certainly welcome one of my colleagues to really jump in here and talk about transportation broadly.
Yeah, I'll jump in, Alan. Thanks for teeing that up. Yes, as Alan said, you've got these very large projects for great opportunities to really celebrate and in a public-facing way make that tie back to the community. But locally, I know within our practice, and Mosi and Derek, Thomas and Zurfel, we realize that there are everyday decisions as an engineer, as a planner, that affect the community. It's from where we locate the bus stop. Is it servicing all the communities? Are we taking into account accessibility, those with movement impairments? Can they board the bus, let's say, or is there space available to create a linear park or to make things more sustainable. And actually that could be a learning moment for the community that, hey, we're taking runoff from the roadway, we're doing X, Y, and Z with it. Here's a chance to learn about it, or maybe make it a little parklet. But it takes that constant thinking, that remembering that, hey, this is in a community. It takes a team to challenge each other. Like, hey, what's going on here? How is this neighborhood working? Because we don't want to just pour concrete or place a bridge without understanding the context of where something is going on. So it's incumbent upon the students, as you advance in your career, to challenge one another, to ask yourself those questions. Derek had mentioned Title VI in his conversation that goes to environmental justice. As a project's being built, for instance, are we making it more difficult? Are we disrupting a community? Are we getting rid of cultural artifacts and places of remembrance, et cetera, just to push a project through? That gets into the NEPA process, which has been in the news a little bit lately due to some changes coming out from the government. So yes, there are these large opportunities to vibrantly connect with the community, but there's also the daily connections which add up to be quite impactful. It's a great question, thank you.
Great.
I think it's also important to take a look at some of the projects that have been built across the country that have a cultural impact and a community impact. Not only from the transit perspective, as Sean had mentioned, are we providing something that's a true benefit to the community and the traveling public? Or if you're looking at communities, look at Columbus, Ohio, for example, when they improved a street, High Street, as it crosses over 670, where they've incorporated construction on both sides of the street so the community is connected, so you don't feel as if you're broken apart by a big gap. And they've done that in other communities across the nation. Or if you look at, say, look at New Orleans. If you consider the Canal Street streetcar project, when they put streetcars back to Canal, that was a cultural connection, so to speak. Historically, they had always been on Canal. They were removed, replaced by buses, and they came back. And that really spoke to the history of New Orleans. So in many aspects, we look to mesh not only a transportation improvement, but also something that matches the culture and the local community.
Great, thank you. Another question is, what can students, young professionals in engineering and science do to learn about, pay tribute to, and honor the history of Black engineers and scientists?
Yeah, I could take that. I think that's a great question. I think the most important thing to do is just to learn your history. And I think a salient part of this conversation today is that we have to understand our past to know where we're going in the future. I think Serafil made the strongest connection with looking at how the traffic signal was developed and the work that he does today. And I think that's what motivates a lot of us in terms of what we do. We know what's happened previously and what has taken our industry to where it has been. Because there's also, I think the biggest thing is the public trust. At the end of the day, we're building systems and places with public funds, and it's the trust that these places will be safe, secure, and meet their needs. So I think the biggest thing is you have to understand the history of those communities and the people that are in them. And I think for us within the Arlington Transportation Practice and the Arlington office for AECOM, we live in those communities. We go to the grocery stores there, we shop, we eat dinner there. So I think being a part of that community and building in it is an important part. But I think it's important just to be curious and continue to see where something has come from. A lot of time you may be looking at a software application or a certain methodology and you just assume that it's the best practice or standard for practice, but it's important to ask the question of why is it the best standard of practice? What was the incident? What were the standards developed from? And lo and behold, you may find that there was someone behind the scenes that took the risk to be the first one to develop it and make it that standard.
Great. Great. Well, I really appreciate that. We're at the top of the hour, so I very much appreciate all the presenters at AECOM. I think it was very informative. There's a lot of things that we all learned, and I think taking it for our future as everyone continues their careers to really understand that history is just so important. So I very much appreciate everyone for your time, and all the participants. I appreciate you for calling in and for your great questions. So thank you.
All right, thank you for
Thank you.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
All right, take care.
Stay safe.